Hello, my name is Ed Alletto. I'm an interpreter. I work in the Oregon State court system. My position is as an interpreter is ASL Interpreter 2. I'm a staff interpreter working for the department under the CIS, Court Interpreter Services. I've worked there for the past 5 years. And in the last 4 years, I'm working both full-time and have additional duties coordinating remote interpreting services, abbreviated RI, and I am responsible for both spoken languages and sign language. Spoken language services are primarily done through telephone interpreting, and the sign language interpreting is done through remote interpreting. I'm going to be focusing on the activities that have happened regarding remote interpreting. Before I start giving you a lot of the facts regarding the technology, the rules and procedures, I'd like first to give you some other information. People had strong feelings about remote interpreting, both positive and negative, but I wanted to speak to the goals that we had in mind with CIS. We had a mission statement, as you can see here. You can see the first thing that was discussed was the provision of quality service, first and foremost. Secondly, we had to have a judicial way of handling the funding. So those two parts of our mission statements are things that we always keep in mind to achieve our goals. With remote interpreting, when we were comparing how that might fit the mission, the goals of quality and handling funding appropriately, then we were going to be able to use that type of service. Until that happened, we weren't able to avail ourselves of any remote interpreting services. Our philosophy initially was consumer-oriented. Our customers are the court systems. And we just mean that in the courtroom, who are the players involved? We're serving all of those members in the courtroom. Our needs came secondary to meeting the court's needs primarily. And speaking of technology, we know that you can get into some complex discussion, and we're not going to have the time to discuss that now. But the technology goal was to make things simple. That was the most critical issue for the courtroom staff. If the technology was too complicated for them to be able to get set up, then they would just discontinue that, and then remote interpreting would not be successful. So in the courtroom, we made sure that the technology was something that could be easily handled and simple. The other technology issue was that you had to be able to accommodate to their technology. Oregon already had 90% of the courtrooms equipped with video systems in their courtrooms. They would either be set up right there in the courtroom. Sometimes it would also be something that would be able to be moved from courtroom to courtroom via a cart. But we didn't have to then come up with all the equipment to be established in their courtrooms. That was already available to us. We just had to make sure that our equipment on our end was compatible with theirs. And we needed to know how to use their equipment. And sometimes it was difficult, but it was their equipment, and we needed to know how to use their equipment in conjunction with ours. When we first started with the remote interpreting back in 2005, and actually spoken language remote interpreting began in 2002. The manager of the program at that time was from Idaho, and you know Idaho is very much a rural state, and interpreters were having to drive long distances to get to their venues. So they established the spoken language interpreters via telephone systems. So when that person then came to Oregon it was determined that that could work well for our spoken language needs in the courts. In 2005, ASL interpreters who were involved, and that was Carrie Richardson, and she used to be Carrie Brewer. She saw the remote interpreting being used for spoken languages via the telephone and thought that that could also be something available for sign language interpreters. So they got the necessary equipment, and we now have the video equipment necessary to use sign language interpreters in the classroom. And that was the beginning in 2005. It was new technology at the time. Internet also at that time was not the most high quality, so the video pictures that we were receiving were oftentimes pixelated and not of the best quality. In 2008, what happened, as I'm sure you're all aware of, the economy did crash. The state funding budget was cut in large amounts. CIS we were thinking that they might be firing some of the interpreters, and we thought how we might be able to help the budget is by using remote interpreting to a greater extent for these interpreting issues and save money. So we discussed things with the courts, and they did not terminate any of the interpreters there. But by 2009, they saw that this was actually a good opportunity for us to try to expand the remote interpreting services. That did get started. We had the data and had rules and policies, procedures established. Then what has happened since that time with having that remote interpreting set up, it's not something that is static. It's something that has ongoing improvements done, and we look at that as a priority, trying to predict what's going to be happening in the future, things that need to be improved and changed, what things are working well, looking at the technology and seeing what might need to be done in the future. So it is not something that is set in stone, but there are always continuous changes and improvements. The technology that we're using when we talk about on the interpreter's end, there are 3 video cameras established, and they're big, heavy pieces of equipment, a large monitor and camera established that they stay in one place, but they're established in 3 different communities. So if the video interpreter is needed, they go to where the equipment exists, and then they hook up to the courtroom. And then 2-3 years ago, we added some more that were webcams, and that was also very convenient because then the interpreter could bring their laptops to that location and be available when something needed to be done through remote interpreting. And they could use their laptops to provide that and then go on and still be able to interpret in person in different venues. In the courtroom, most of them were using the Polycom equipment. Just recently, some of the courtrooms have done some renovations and put in new equipment. Some have chosen a different vendor, not Polycom, but I would say that over 90% of the courtrooms use the Polycom equipment. Our interpreter equipment is compatible. It's also the Polycom equipment, so that works very well. And we can control the view of the cameras in the courtroom, zooming in and so on. That's very convenient. And we have our private internet that was used there within the state, which makes it of higher quality than the general internet. You know that sometimes the internet can be quite slow. It can then glitch, freeze up. So it's better that we have our own internet that then takes care of the issues, and we can do things ourselves to improve conditions when things have problems. We do have a scheduling system for remote interpreting, and there are 2 aspects that are very convenient. We have a centralized scheduling system. The different courtrooms will contact us making requests for interpreters, whether they be spoken language or sign language. We then look to find the appropriate interpreter to be in that situation, and we then are responsible for paying for the interpreters. In that way, we can then manage the quality of the interpreting services. We know the interpreter and their skills. We also then can determine what the consumer's needs are and make the appropriate match. The other aspect that has worked in our favor is that the scheduling system is very professional. It works very well for scheduling interpreters. So we've given the proper training for the interpreters, and we provide other types of training, such as on the code of ethics, and we invite them to learn more, and we make them understand the fact that interpreters who are asked to interpret for lengthy periods of time by themselves can then cause problems to occur and mistakes in their interpretation. So we've helped them to understand the professionalism that we're striving for in providing the necessary interpreters. And so we recommended to the state of Oregon that they set up a centralized scheduling system. I think this is something that would be very much conducive to all states to have such a system. And you could then incorporate spoken language in their system, and then you can work together as the two different language entities. When a request is made for an interpreter, we have to determine whether it is more appropriate to provide a face-to-face interpreter, or is this appropriate for remote interpreting. We are not rules bound. We do take into consideration many factors. We have to assess each situation individually. The first step that we undertake is we look at the request that's being made and what possible resources they may have in their area. Is there someone who is skilled and qualified, or is there not someone who can provide the necessary service? At that point, we then look to what other possibilities are for providing the service, the distance between the 2 points, and whether we go ahead and provide a face-to-face interpreter. That is not all that is done. There's further assessments that are being done. We look at the proceedings that will be taking place, whether there will be testimony given. You know, testimony that's done through remote interpreting is very difficult. We advise them not to do witness testimony via remote interpreting. Oftentimes you have lawyers making strong points and making their arguments, and that is not well conveyed through the video remote interpreting. And then also the length of the assignment, if it's going to be for more than a short period, we recommend that that's not the most feasible solution for, by providing remote interpreting. We ask the court their opinion and make sure that the judge is open to having a video interpreter. Some are more resistant to the idea. Sometimes the judge wants further information, so we will talk with that judge, explain how everything works, and sometimes based on our budget we can explain to them that we're saving money by not having to spend the money on travel time, and then we ask the judge's opinion. We let the judge make the final decision. We don't force our service on them. And we also then ask both parties what they feel about the whole idea of remote interpreting. And if they're accepting of it, then we might proceed to provide that service. So, we looked at the budget. We looked at all the different processes and proceedings that needed to take place. Now, we have to use our judgment as to what is the most appropriate. We need to make sure that we're providing quality service. We are also looking at budget concerns. So we don't automatically determine that remote interpreting is the best service to be provided. It's upon the analysis of the situation that we make that determination. Give you a general idea that most of the time that the first time a person appears in court for an arraignment, most of the time that appears appropriate for remote interpreting. If it's just a meeting to ask for more information about the case and establish a future court date, something as simple as that, say 5 or 10 minutes, then that also is appropriate for remote interpreting. If the defendant is going to just appear and plead guilty, that is something that's possibly done through remote interpreting. In the courtroom, is that where the place that everything's going to be taking place, or is it going to just be a private meeting with the judge? Is the deaf person just appearing to pay a fine and needs to talk to staff members of the court? Is that something that might be feasible through remote interpreting? That definitely is sometimes a possibility. Now I'd like to speak to the data that we've collected. I would like you to look at this overhead first. This chart shows how many times we provided interpreters via remote interpreting and those with person in face-to-face. And you'll see with the red line, that was the interpreters being provided through remote interpreting. And as you can see, the requests for interpreting services have declined over time from 2008 to 2011. What you'll notice is that with that red indicator that there's been an increase in requests. In 2008, the percentage of interpreting being done via remote interpreting was just 2%. This last year, for 2011, that number has increased to 14%. So that's quite a significant increase. It has gone up by 5 times. In regards to the budget, look at this overhead. You can see how much is being spent, for the remote interpreting, the different numbers and the rise. But you see that the savings have increased exponentially. In 2011, we saved about $35,000, $30,000 to $35,000, which is a significant amount of savings. Our goal was not to save a great deal of money, but if the money is spent wisely, then then can be used for other needs. The remote interpreting is not always precise, fluent, and smooth. Of course, sometimes there are issues that arise, some problems or mistakes. The biggest problem, and you can see here on the chart, the numbers, on average, 11% of the remote interpreting has errors and complaints that are filed. It just means that something went wrong. The person did not like something. They let us know and we document that. And you can see what types of complaints there are in this overhead. You can see the 2 largest ones. This one, they say it's unknown. They don't know the reason. They made a complaint, but we weren't able to determine what was specific regarding that complaint. The other larger number was in regards to the connection, that the staff in the courtroom had a difficult time in making the necessary adjustments to their equipment. Or perhaps the staff does not know how to connect with our interpreter. That was over 1/3 of those complaints and errors, based on the fact that the staff may not have been as proficient in using the equipment. One was mine. I didn't put the plug-in for the headset into the wrong space, and so I didn't know what was going on, and I ended up calling over the phone and trying to do the interpreting that way. And we were able to proceed, but it was awkward and embarrassing for me. We're looking forward and seeing that there are definitely more changes and challenges. the interpreters having to convey information in the hallway. You know that oftentimes the deaf person comes into the room and is before the judge and is being provided service through remote interpreting. But when they go out in the hall wanting to speak to the attorney, for example, or if there's a form that needs to be filled out, or they need to pay a fine, that creates challenges. How will the interpreter who is being provided in the courtroom be able to provide all the other incidental information that takes place, like in the hallways and other places? When you saw one of the major issues being the staff, people not knowing how to use the equipment, and so our people do know how to use the equipment, but oftentimes the staff in the courtroom does not really know how to use the equipment. Oftentimes also in the courtroom, the attorney wishes to speak to his client there, and that can be extremely difficult to provide that through remote interpreting. And so sometimes the lawyer will say, I need to have a private conversation with my client. The judge will then empty the courtroom, allow that time, and then call everyone back in. It's a bit of an awkward situation. The last issue is measuring the consumer's satisfaction. You know, the court system doesn't measure their level of satisfaction. You know, you're just saying, you don't say things like, you're going to be sent to jail for 2 years, does that satisfy you? You know, so how do we gather this kind of information? We have tried to do different things, but have found it fairly frustrating. We're still working on that process. So that is a basic summary of what I wanted to share with you, so thank you for your attention today.